If we only had better coordination, this would have never happened because we would have sorted out all those insurgents. And again, we say, okay, in an ideal world, that's right, we would have done that. And we would have allocated those resources to all the infrastructure projects where value was maximized. But if you go back to that previous slide and look at poor feedback mechanisms, no profit and loss, poor information flows, you should say, wait, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to coordinate, you just can't do it. So let's stop pretending like we can and wasting lots of money in the process. But here it's not even a waste of money. We actually put our own troops in harm's way because we were basically funding the people we were fighting against. So how do you avoid this? Well, don't do it. Let's stop the over-reliance on bureaucracy. Okay, it's not a matter of better planning and better coordination. Better planning and better coordination is a bureaucrat's favorite phrase because you're not responsible for anything then. If you blame it on the planning, the coordination, it's always someone else's fault, right? By the way, we see this in the United States all the time too, right? If you ever hear like the people in the Department of Education talk about, and they'll say, well, we've given you so much money, but exam grades have fallen. And like, well, if we only had more, if we had just used it here instead of here, if we had coordinated better between the different groups, next time we're really going to get it, I promise. At some point, we have lots of empirical evidence to support this, which say, no, this isn't going to happen. There's something else going on here. All right? Well, what else does this do? We're trying to plan, again, there's an irony here, but free markets. We're trying to implement free markets abroad, which relies on what? Private initiative, private responsibility, taking responsibility for what you do, whether good or bad. This is what a free society based on principles of liberalism is grounded in. But then we say, look, we are going to basically do this through massive central planning. So this puts unrealistic faith in bureaucracy, and it creates a culture of dependence on bureaucrats for getting things done, as compared to the ability of individual entrepreneurs in that country to solve problems for themselves. This goes back to that distinction between planners and searchers. So there's this tension between the over-reliance on bureaucracy and our goals, which is to establish liberal orders. So let me provide an example for what we could do in Iraq right now, because typically in my book, for instance, I talk about kind of an alternative strategy. But people say, look, we're in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're not leaving tomorrow, so if you were going to give advice, what would you do, based on what you just talked about? I'm going to give you an example of something I think we can do that overcomes these trends. So what's the problem in Iraq? Well, here's one of the main concerns. High unemployment. One of the things you'll see is that GDP has gone up, but it's a fake out. It's kind of like in the United States, right? If you spend lots of money, you can get GDP to go up, right? You can buy, balls for people to juggle with. And they're like, look, we produce stuff, right? But of course, what we care as economists is producing things that people value, consumer goods, right? Of course, with the Soviet Union, what was happening? Lots of very high GDP, but they were producing goods that people couldn't consume. You can't eat steel, right? So we're creating all these jobs. They're all in the public sector for the most part. There's very few new private businesses opening. I'm going to tell you why in a moment. You have lots of jobs being created in public sector, but still very high unemployment even with that. You have high corruption. The budget's driven by oil prices to a large extent. So when they fell, or when they vary at all, the budget varies as well. So you're increasing the number of public employees through these employment programs, right? But you need some way to pay them. So there's tons of pressure on the national budget. Now, what's being proposed? Well, very similar to what's being proposed in the United States. More job programs, right? More spending, more aid. That's what's being proposed. Well, there's another solution. What are all these other people doing that are unemployed? Again, maybe they're not smart. We can make that argument. Culturally, they're not entrepreneurial, right? Well, again, as an economist, I say, no, I don't believe that. I don't believe they leave big bills laying around. What I'm predicting is that there's no big bills there because maybe they reach down to pick it up and someone slaps their hand away. Or maybe they pick it up and it's really not what they thought it was. The incentives are not in place. Well, take a look at this. The World Bank puts out a Doing Business Index. It's based on the work by the economist Hernando de Soto. Some of you may have heard of him. He has two books that he's well known for, The Other Path and The Mystery of Capital. And basically, de Soto's from Peru. And here's the quick Cliff Note version of this. You should read it. Both of them are very good books and very accessible to economists and non-economists alike. De Soto grew up in Peru, all right? And when he was back in Peru, he walked around and he said, my country is so poor, but I walk around and see all these entrepreneurs selling and buying. So it can't be the entrepreneurial spirit argument that Peru lacks the entrepreneurial spirit. There must be something else going on. So what did he do? Well, he has an institute set up there. I forget the exact name of it. But what he did was he went through the process of opening a business himself. And he wrote down every little thing he had to do, the permits, the bribes, all the corruption. And then when he was done, he created what we call now an investor roadmap. So if you ever hear that phrase coming out of the World Bank or any of the international organizations, that's kind of where the origin of that came from. And guess what? It's in the book, reprinted in really small print. It was really big. In other words, to open like a fruit stand, he had to go through hundreds of different steps, pay all these bribes, right? And if we realize that people respond to costs and benefits, if you raise the cost of opening a business, what happens? You get less private business. Well, the Doing Business Index through the World Bank is an attempt to basically operationalize De Soto's insight across countries. And they have, I think, 8 or 9 different measures. It's like things like number of steps to open a business, number of steps to close it, because bad businesses, we want to go out of business so we can reallocate those resources, the number of bribes you have to pay, and so on. And you can just Google this and pull it up. It's very easy to find. Well, guess what? Iraq, where we're trying to establish free markets, ranked number 153. All right? Below countries which many of us would consider very unfree countries, so 153 in the index. All right? No one, or I take that back, very few people have actually talked about this. All right? Which again is odd given that we want to establish markets. If we want to establish markets, the first thing we tend to think about is entrepreneurs. Again, if you understand basic economics, you realize the cost, if you raise the cost of entrepreneurship, you get less of it. So what could we do to overcome these problems? Get rid of the regulations. Get rid of the regulations. Notice this doesn't fall prey to the knowledge trap, because I'm not saying I want to invest lots of money in the fruit business, the fruit industry. That's like how development works now, right? You get lots of aid and you target certain areas based on the government. And then they have these import substitution arguments where it's basically infant industry type arguments. It's basically central planning the economy. Notice that removing business barriers doesn't do that, because it says people can start a business. You want to start a water bottle business? You're welcome to try it. You want to start a fruit business? That's fine. But without those regulations, people can observe potential profit opportunities, whether they're right or wrong, and take a risk. And that's what entrepreneurship is. Credible commitment trap. You say, well, you said that unless they bind themselves, people won't buy into it. So if they just say, look, we're going to reduce business regulations, no one's going to believe them because they've never done it in the past. Well, we have a solution to this. Shut down the enforcers. Shut them down. That would be the way around this. If there's no one to enforce the regulations, then that's credible. No one can touch, no one can come. You don't have to pay a bribe to this person because that person doesn't exist anymore. Their function doesn't exist. All right? It would recognize the status quo, recognize that basically this is the problem, and you'd overcome tons of problems. Would this be a panacea? Of course not. But guess what? One of the things we have to realize in development in general is there's no panacea out there. There's no magic bullet. It's not like if we just write down a better set of instructions, all of a sudden we get the outcome we want. So what we want to do is rely on individual initiative. And this is the way to do it in Iraq. Let's talk about a broader strategy. This is what I lay out in the last chapter of my book. I'm amazed that we tend to think that in order to get change abroad, we basically have to force it on people. And if somehow you're against that, you're an isolationist. Well, isolationism typically means, or at least I've thought about it in terms of not lack of military involvement, but basically mercantilism, cutting ourselves out from outside trade, right? Shutting our country off from outside trade, and then not using our military abroad, but also cutting ourselves out, right? People that make arguments against globalization, we're losing jobs to India, China, Mexico, right? They're isolationists. They want to isolate the United States. So here's the alternative. I'm often called an isolationist. I don't know why. Let's talk about this. Free trade, right? Including the movement of people, because people are a type of good that's able to move, right? Combined with the entrepreneurial spirit of seeing opportunities and moving to take advantage of them. Now, free trade is one of the most misunderstood topics that I've ever come across. People just don't get it. They just don't get it. They say, look, if country X puts trade barriers against us, we must retaliate and put trade barriers up to punish them.